Well, Florence Hospital in Florence, South Carolina, but May 13th, 1928. But my family was living at Wachesaw here on the river. Daddy farmed there.
Tell me a little about your parents, your dad and your mom.
Mama was a school teacher for 17 years, and in fact taught some years after she was married. And she had 8 grades at Collins Creek in Horry County, which is just across the line here, that she taught in one classroom, the only teacher. She rode to school on horseback, and she realized that most of her students had illiterate parents, so my grandmother started going with her in the buggy at night, and they go back to try to teach the parents some reading and writing. And Mama at that same time taught some of her the African-American neighbors in the neighborhood here, because there was no school whatsoever for them. And she taught those at home at night. There was one old woman, I mean she was old then, that walked, I know, from Willbrook, which is, oh maybe, gosh, 6 miles down the road from here, I'd say at least, or 5. And I know that she came, walked all the way up here to get a little bit of learning. And I have worked at the, in the past I worked with the polls when we had voting, and years back, I remember feeling very proud that someone would say, Miss, I don't have to make a mark, I can sign my name because your mama taught me how.
What about your dad?
Oh, and Daddy. Daddy died when I was only 8 years old, and he was farming, as I said, at Wachesaw, but he was ill, not well, for the last several years that he lived. And we had moved back here to Murrells Inlet before his death. But, and of course Wachesaw is Murrells Inlet too, but over on the river. Daddy was, he served in First World War. And so, well, my mother did too. She was, she was a YWCA hostess. Each state chose 2 young women that they sent overseas to, sort of the forerunner of special services in World War, in the later wars. And they didn't meet though in Europe. They were in the same division, Rainbow Division. I mean, Mama, of course, is a civilian. But Daddy came back and was, he came to Murrells Inlet with a group of friends from Williamsburg County, where he lived, for a house party. They happened to rent a house from my grandfather, and Mama always said that my grandmother fell in love with him. But, and she said that, I think, well anyway, he wrote to Mama when he went back to Cedar Swamp, which is near Kingsbury in Williamsburg County. And Mama put a letter to him on the table, but never bothered to put a stamp and mail it, so my grandmother mailed it. And I suppose that's what led to the marriage, the fact that she answered his letter. Daddy was a wonderful father, but having lost him so young, my memories are like little scenes from a movie. My sister June was born 3 years before I was, and then my 3 brothers came right in a row after I was born. They were, I think, but my brother Tommy, Thomas Mobley, named for Daddy, so he was junior. Tommy has been deceased about 8 years, I think now, 8 years this spring. And the other 2 brothers, so thankful they retired back here. They both were with the space program in Houston all of their working years as engineers, and did some really very important work with the space program, in fact. But it's good to have them here, and their wives. I started out in a 2-room schoolhouse here at Murrells Inlet with a wonderful teacher, Miss Wessel, and she had 4 grades in one room. So in the 1st grade, I was in the 1st row. And you know, I think it wasn't a bad system if you didn't have to give a teacher too many students, because if you paid attention, you would, she would get the 1st grade working on ABCs, maybe out of script, you know, making rows of A's and rows of B's, something about handwriting. Then she'd move on to the 2nd grade, and probably it was arithmetic, and maybe 3rd grade was spelling. But if you did your work in a hurry, you listened to the rest. So it was a pretty good way to learn. I'm sure it wasn't easy for the teacher. But anyway, my sister was in the 4th grade, and the only thing bad about that period was that she was in the same classroom. She couldn't wait to jump off the school bus and tell Mama everything I'd done wrong that day, as a big sister would. But then they moved us to Myrtle Beach School. We rode the bus by the time I was in the 3rd grade. And Myrtle Beach had the elementary. Well, in those days we didn't have middle school. It was just the elementary and high school, and all in one, one building, one location. So I was there until I graduated in 45, I think. Yeah, 45. We didn't have the 12 grades either. 11.
So 11, 12.
Yeah. You know, I cut school one time, shortly before graduation, with 3 other girls, and we went to Conway. We were going to have a ball game with that Conway that night. I think we got on a Greyhound bus and went to Conway. I don't know how we got by. I guess our parents thought we were going on to the ball game, so we were supposed to be in Conway. Anyway, we went into the auditorium. We were hanging around the Conway school because we cut school and they were still in class. The superintendent, Mr. Seabrook, I forgot. But the superintendent of Conway School found these 4 girls wandering around in Conway High School, and he asked our names. And the first girl he asked didn't give her name. She gave the name of the smartest girl in our class. So the other 3 followed suit. And when I said, I'm Carolyn Grimm, and it was a lie, he said, I'm Carolyn's uncle. So what I remember about, that's the only time, the only lie I remember in my life, outright lie. But I did follow the lead of the other girl. But anyway, on the night of our graduation from high school, he came up and saw me in line, and he said, if I talked to Ernest Southern, who was our superintendent, if I talked to Ernest Southern right now, you wouldn't get that diploma, would you? He never told on us. So that I remember about graduation. The other thing I remember is a sense of fear and fright, which I also felt when I graduated from college. It was sort of like, gosh, Mama's not supposed to take care of me anymore. I'm supposed to do something about this life ahead. I went to Coker College in Hartsville because it was the nearest school to Murrells Inlet. And there was, of course, toward the last years of the war, but there was still gas rationing and no such thing as having, well, of course, students didn't have cars in those days, but neither would Mama have been able to come riding up to Hartsville to bring me home anytime. So Hartsville was a place 99 miles from Myrtle Beach. Myrtle Beach was 12 miles or 13 from the inlet. And so that's why I chose Coker, but I've always been thankful I did, because it was a wonderful school. The influence, there were really great professors there, and the influence on me at that age or at that time in my life was grand. And I think I was very fortunate, actually, that my first year I was elected class president as a freshman. Nobody knew me, but nobody knew anybody. But that put me on student council, and that sort of set a pattern. I didn't tell any more lies like I'd done in high school. And so therefore I wound up as president of student government and May Queen when I was a senior. So college was a real kind of wonderful time, happy time, and a hard time too. Hard because Myrtle Beach didn't offer the courses in high school that we needed for college. And I was accepted in college on probation simply because I had not had what I needed. It made college very tough because math was my least favorite subject, and I had to take 4 years instead of 2. Same with foreign language, 4 instead of 2, because I had not had a high school background. So that made college tough for me. And I think I remember feeling you know, a little bit of resentment toward our state of South Carolina, that they didn't do better by students in those days. But at the same time, it's interesting to me, I look back on this, and I was taking a class, it was speech, and my senior exam was to be a 5-minute talk. And so I felt a deep sort of resentment that South Carolina hadn't done better with education for me, for my generation. I was very conscious of the fact that it did far less for the African American students. And I think my whole speech that day was about, suppose I'd been born black in Georgetown County, Murrells Inlet, South Carolina. I wouldn't be graduating from college today, or it'd be very unlikely. And that was my talk. In the midst of that talk, the man who was janitor of the college, and he'd always helped us, you know, when the girls had to do any work like decorate for a dance, whatever we were doing, he was always there and helping us, so he was our good friend. And I suddenly felt this feeling that someone in the wings behind the auditorium, beyond the stage, was watching me. I turned and there was John. And it sort of tore me up. I started crying. I couldn't finish my talk because his face was a look of amazement as he looked at me. And of course my teacher gave me an A++, even though I think she liked my subject. But his look on his face, just I couldn't continue to talk. And I think another thing about Coker College, it began with my mother, but there were professors there. Let's see, I graduated, no, 48 was the year Strom Thurmond ran as the Dixiecrat for president. And I had joined something called Student Volunteer Movement. It was really under the National Council of Churches, and they would prepare you to be a missionary. And I was really very, very serious about that. My mother-in-law told me later that my mother prayed me out of that situation. She said she was so afraid you'd go to China. And had I gone to China at that time, I probably would not have gotten home either. And China was where they were planning to head us. But I remember in my senior year, what kept me from going on with that program was it was obvious that here in South Carolina and in the South there was going to be a changing of times, and there were going to be troubled times. And I remember talking to the woman who came to the college occasionally to keep up with where we were headed, and I said, I don't want to go overseas. I want to stay here and work in the South where I know what the problems are. And she said, we can't use you. This was before civil rights movements and things were, had developed. But that kept me from going to China. That period at Coker with those professors, they certainly would have been just far more aware than I was of where the South was headed, where the country was headed. And I think that they did a very good job of hitting the right chords in the students. They caused us to think, which is the best way to learn. I worked a year in Conway in the county library. I had graduated. Technically I made a terrible mistake. I graduated with a degree in English and a minor in religion and art, and I wasn't prepared to do any job on earth that I know of. Mama, fortunately, had made friends with the young woman who had come to Conway as a trained librarian. We'd had these, I read in the Georgetown Times this morning about years and years ago, this was 75 years ago, I think, how there was a dance in Georgetown to raise money for the library, and I thought of my dear friend Effie Thatcher, who was the grandmother of Trudy, who now is in the Georgetown Library, because she and her friend Mary Bonds built the library in the county, Georgetown, by having benefits, things like bridge benefits and dances. And this is in that little column that says 50 years ago and so forth. There's something today. They don't call their names, but they should have. Anyway, But that was the beginning of the Georgetown Library. But Conway was ahead of us. They had hired a young woman to come there, and they built a beautiful new county library. And so she hired me as an assistant because they couldn't have afforded to pay more than one trained person at that time. And then she persuaded me to go to library school. I hadn't worked very long when she started telling me I should go on for graduate school. And so a cousin loaned me the money because Mama, I thought I can't let Mama do any more of sending me. There were 3 boys behind me that needed to go to school. And so a cousin of my mother's loaned me the money to go to Chapel Hill. And that was the nearest school again, nearest to home. Otherwise it was Emory in Atlanta. That sounded like, that was as bad as China. But anyway, and fortunately I had a friend from high school who went to Chapel Hill as an undergraduate. And he had a car, so Billy Rook was wonderful about telling me when he was coming home, and I was able to get rides home. And so that was, in those days, the library degree at Chapel Hill didn't offer a master's. It was a BS in library science and a 1-year program instead of 2. While I was there, the dean called me in one day and said, you know, as young, most of the people in library school had been working maybe 10 or 12 or 15 years and then decided to go to library school. So I was among the youngest in the class. And she said, you know, the government has a program that if I were your age, I would take advantage of it because you could travel and more than you would ever be able to travel on your own. And she talked to me about the Special Services Program, Department of the Army. And she persuaded me that that would be the wise thing for me to do and come back home to be in a county or public library, you know, later. I wrote my mother a postcard about it, and she sent me a postcard by return mail, just what I'd like for you to do. Because, see, she had gone in the First World War. This was after the war. I mean, I was after the war. Well, so was she. She was over there during the occupation after the First World War. But anyway, it was 1951. And I had a friend from Kentucky who also, Miss Kelly, the dean, had persuaded her to go. So we were going to go together. But Lord, her family just told her absolutely no. And I've never understood how I managed to, having grown up in Murrells Inlet, how I managed to decide to go on alone. My sister recently said, I just don't know how you did that, but I'm glad I did. It was a wonderful experience. And as Miss Kelly, the dean, had said, I was able to travel a lot that I could never have managed in another way. They would even let us work for 6 weeks without a day off and then have an accumulated, you know, week or so. It was wonderful.
So tell me about that experience.
Well, one thing, well, you all could relate to this now after the happenings in September. When I was a child, we were terribly indoctrinated to hate the Japanese and the Germans. I think it was more fear than hate, but we certainly were well indoctrinated to fear them. And I really did believe, when you'd see copies of Life magazine is the thing I remember that was so frightening because, you know, as they found prison camps, for instance, and then there were photographs of these people who had starved. Also, anyway, had we had television then, I don't believe people could have survived what they would have seen. But I guess after the war, I mean, I still had this feeling about the Germans. It was wonderful to get over there and have these just great people working in the libraries with me, and I loved them. And of course, always fear is what causes us these prejudices that we all have. Another thing that was wonderful about that, Val, was that the girls I worked with were from places like New York State, California, Idaho, Iowa, Midwest, and I was always the only Southern girl in the crowd. And they were forever assuming that I had this severe feeling toward African American people. that I couldn't relate to. I was blessed when I grew up here in the inlet, except for Mama and Daddy and my sister. In my early childhood, I was surrounded by more African Americans than whites because Daddy was farming and there were people there. That I learned, I mean, I grew up knowing that I was loved by them, and that naturally you love people who love you. So that was the strongest influence of my childhood for good in my life. It's made a difference in my life. But so over there, I was so baffled by these girls who expected me to dislike and not be kind even to the soldiers who were African American. The integration of the armed forces began while I was there. So this became an issue. When I first got over there, actually, there were certain posts that were totally, except for white officers and that sort of thing, were totally black. Then there were others that were totally white. Then they were integrated. General Eisenhower came to Washington to tell President Truman that it just wouldn't work. I don't think that's known in history much, but I mean, I think he feared how it could happen, how it could work. But they did the smartest thing in the world. They integrated the MP units first. And then we were called into the post commander would have meetings of the civilian employees and the wives of the military, that sort of thing. And they just simply said, you work with this system or you go home. They don't, you know. So that worked. But anyway, back to these girls. I noticed that one evening I went to the Post Theater. I was off work, and as I got there to buy my ticket, a boy, Terry, from the Philippines, who was very oriental, happened to step up to get his ticket, so we walked in the door together, and we sat down together. And some of the girls I lived with just went all to pieces that I had a date. I didn't have a date with Terry. We just happened to be there together. But that I would have sat in the theater with an Oriental. Terry was one of the first Orientals I never knew in my life, you know, there were none here. And I began to see that it all depends on where you grew up. Everybody has these attitudes. And again, it's always fear of the unknown, mostly. And I was walking on the street in Hamburg one day, but anyway, that all was good for me. And but I was on the street in Hamburg, and a German man walked by me. I was in uniform, but otherwise he might not have known I was American. But he walked past me, and then he whirled around and he spit in my face, and he says, "Sie stinkt, sie stinkt, sie ist Amerikanisch." And you know, so he was hating me only because I was American, and I thought, well, probably his home was bombed, and maybe his wife and children were killed, or maybe he lost all of his family in the war, maybe, you know, no telling what had happened to him. But he hated Americans, obviously, and Hamburg had been bombed a lot, so, but I think it never hurt me to have a German spit on me and let me know he hated me because I was American. It's a good lesson. I came back home after almost 3 years. It was supposed to be a 2-year tour of duty. Mama made me promise not to fly home, not to fly. And so I'd gone over on the ship. But we had to travel space available since we weren't military. And space available was just, there was never any space available on the ship. And finally, I knew I would have to fly or either extend I'd already extended 8 months. I'd been all into the 3rd year. And it was getting near Christmas, and I wanted to come home. And so I flew, but I didn't tell Mama till I got to New York. Thank God the plane made it, because I was betraying, you know, what I'd promised her I wouldn't fly. But anyway, that was December of '53. Georgetown County Library had already contacted me while I was still over there because some of the people knew me and asked if I would consider that job when I came home. And so I went down and was interviewed and started work January '54. And that's where I had the wonderful contact with Ms. Barnes and Ms. Thatcher. And I mentioned a while ago the last recent meeting of the people who had worked on the Amistad committees and different things. And of course it was a public meeting too, but most of the people who attended the last meeting had been involved one way or another. And and I think that evening that one person, we were trying to sum up, well, how effective, had it been worth all the money that Ron Engel and Coastal and other people raised, you know, they raised a lot of money to cause that to happen. And then there was some disappointment that not quite as many people had come to see the ship and to learn its history as they had thought would. And then they said, well, if as many had come as they wanted, they couldn't have gotten on there anyway. So, but anyway, that was sort of what we were doing, summing up the whole happening. And one young woman said somewhere during the evening that Georgetown was a city in denial, or a town in denial. And I thought, gosh, now she really has she's nailed it down absolutely correctly. I thought I never would have thought of that term. I wouldn't have thought of that, wording it that way. But then I remember saying later that I believed what she had said was absolutely true, but they'd come a long way from the 50s. A long, long way as a town. I started working there in '54, and a case was coming up. I mean, that is, a man had bought marshland here in Murrells Inlet, and he wanted to dredge a great big channel back to the beach out yonder, which would make the creek front be waterfront lots and the ocean. As it was, the marsh grew right up to the banks of the beach. And this was actually a test case about dredging in South Carolina. And as though I was young, I was really disturbed because I knew it would damage Murrells Inlet forever. I mean, I somehow knew that, though we had not seen any dredging yet at that time. But so we organized, a few people now organized something called the Murrells Inlet Protective Association. We went to court, we lost, but in the process I came to know my husband, future husband, very well. And he and his mother, in fact, shared my feelings about that. And so I guess we started meeting. Hurricane Hazel came in October of '54, and we started meeting in September of '54. And then it got so that Bill would come down for a weekend and stop by the house to see how our case was progressing and that sort of thing. And one evening, I'm telling some stories that I told in that book. But anyway, one evening Mama said, "Sis, I can't bear to think I might die." She was younger than I am now. She said, "I can't bear to think I might die and leave you alone." I was 26 and I hadn't married. And I mean, you know, in those days you were an old maid confirmed and no possibility. Well, I still had dated people occasionally, but I just hadn't really fallen in love. I mean, I'm sure of that because when I did, I didn't question whether I'd marry or not. I knew I would. But I think that we all, if we've married, know there's just a difference there. But anyway, when Mama said that, I said, "Mama, if I could find a man like Bill Peterkin, I think I'd want to marry." But he was 24 years older than I, so marriage had never occurred to me. I mean, he was a widower. His first wife had died some years before. And so Bill was charming and interesting and intelligent and kind and good and everything I could say. And anyway, well, lo and behold, it probably wasn't more than a month or so after that he asked me if I would he wanted to go look at the Dunes Club. They built a new golf course over there at Myrtle Beach, and he wanted to see that. And he had one son who was in the Navy at that time, out in the Pacific. And in fact, William had been home, and we had fished together that summer, the three of us. But I think Bill started the conversation basically with telling me that he could see that William and I could be friends. I think he had feared. His mother had a stepmother when she was young. Her mother died when she was very small. And she considered stepmothers to be the wicked witch from the east or something worse than that. So I think Bill had grown up with this. He just couldn't give his son a stepmother. Well, since he was 24 years older than I, my stepson was 9 years younger than I. So he was like a younger brother to me when we did marry, you know. So if he was right, we could be friends. And he didn't have to deal with me as a stepmother. But anyway, I'm sure that's not the only reason he decided to marry me, but he asked me to marry him while we went to look at the Dunes Club. And then I really thought it was ridiculous. I mean, you know, I just threw me completely off. But later he took me down, he told me he wanted to show me something down the road in down below Georgetown, and it was old St. James Church on the Santee. And when we got there that day, he told me to kneel down at the altar, and he knelt down and asked me to marry him. And so if I ever felt angry, I'd say, "You tricked me." I mean, what girl would say no to a man who did that? Who wasn't even a member of a church. He was a very independent thinker, but he was sincere in that. Anyway, and you know, it's strange. We were, in spite of the difference in our ages, we were married 28 years before his death. My sister married when she was 21 to a young man a few years older than she, and Ken died of cancer when he was only 46, 47. And then my father died at 46, so it's, you can't determine things like that. We had one son, besides my stepson.
All right.
And Jim was a wonderful, wonderful young man. He died in an accident when he was 20. But he had lived long enough for me to know where he was headed. I've often thought that if you have to lose a child, I mean, so many people do when they're so small. And I was blessed in that I saw that he really was going to be the person we would have hoped we had raised. And if he died at 13, I thought, golly, dude, we both failed as parents. Maybe 13 to 15, you know. They have to do a little rebelling to become who they are separate from the parents. Oh dear, I lived in Calhoun County on the farm. My husband was a cotton farmer. And up there I was in everything from mental health to council on aging to what's now Lung Association. I mean, you know, just all the things that were going on in the area. Since I've been back down here, I really have. I came back here in '72. We came back because my mother needed someone to take care of her, and we knew she'd be happier here than if we made her move up to the farm. So we came here, and then my son's death caused me to. We stayed. It happened at the same time, but I think League of Women Voters has been one of my favorites. Though I haven't been very active in years. I just pay my dues and get to meetings when I can. But I do really, my heart's in what they do. The things that have mattered the most to me are the conservation groups I've worked with. I'm on the board of South Carolina Coastal Conservation League now, and that's a route that I've been drawn to for years. And I don't think there's no way we're going to do too much in that direction. No way. My family say I'm a pushover. And then they say I was born under the sign of Taurus. They say I'm bullheaded. So, I mean, that's kind of a contradiction, isn't it? But I suppose that it's important to me to be loved, and the way we get love is to show love. So I believe that's been kind of a guiding thing in my life. And I find it very easy to love people. I used to tell my son that I thought a perfect relationship is when you can love a person and like the same person. And sometimes we like and we don't love, and sometimes we love and we don't like. But when you put the two together, that's when it's right. I was wondering yesterday if my Christmas hang-up is because of how sad Christmas was when I was little. Mama, I remember the first Daddy died in November, And Mama had sold her first short story to Scribner's Magazine, and she had a check for $25. And that was above and beyond about a $62 check she was getting from the Writers Project every year. And so we had Christmas. In other words, there was a gift for each child, and we had the stocking hung up with an orange and apples, some nuts, and some hard candy. But it was the community around me. Mama had a lot of friends who, I think due to World War I, really, a number of them had their sweethearts were killed in the World War I. They never married. They were professors mostly in colleges, these women who'd grown up with her, and they just never married. And so we were blessed in that we had these friends of hers. We were always getting a package at Christmas from, we called them all aunt, but they were not blood kin. And so Mama, right or wrong, on Christmas morning, when we had opened up all these packages from all these people and gotten our stocking off and pulled out what was in that, and generally our Christmas from Santa Claus was one gift each, but Mama would have us go through. For one thing, she had a cousin who was sent about a big box of hard candy. I mean, just a big box. So anyway, we went through all we had, and then she put us in the car, and we took off to go and give. Till we received, we had nothing to give. And that wasn't much fun, you know, when you were a little child. But I thank the Lord for that now. It didn't hurt us a bit, but it was, you know, at that, I can remember feeling almost being punished, because first of all, by doing that, we saw the lack of things that other people had, and that was painful. And then having to give away something you'd just gotten before you could play with it was tough. But boy, that's what we did. And it wasn't easy in Murrells Inlet to find people, white and black, who had no Christmas. The church always had a Christmas tree and had a little bag of fruit, and I know that there were many children that was Christmas. And all churches didn't have that, so therefore Christmas, you know, I hate it, but I think, well, especially this fall, because of the happenings in September, I felt, how can we possibly spend all the millions and billions we'll spend in this country on Christmas? Why can't we let it be a thing for children? Why in the world can't we let it be a thing for children, as far as the gifts go? And we've just been on the wrong track for so long. And my grandfather used to say, when he was about my age, the world's on a treadmill headed straight to hell. And I knew he was crazy as hell. And, you know, I swear the older you get, the more you see that the world's on the treadmill headed straight to hell. And I think Christmas is one of the worst sins we commit, the way we celebrate Christmas. I really do believe that. And I don't know, it'll never happen, but if we could just go back to letting it be Santa Claus coming down the chimney with a gift for children, it would, and all that money could go to things that are needed somewhere else. So I'm just, since at the moment I've been sick lately, I'm thinking I'm going to skip it this year. I've always wanted to. This year I'm going to skip it. I'm not, of course, I'm not. And the church part of it was always a strong part of our childhood. And after all, if you've grown up that way, that's what Christmas is. But there again, that gets lost in the shuffle.
So describe church during Christmas time.
We would, as I said, have the Christmas tree at the church, and I was. I think it was very thrilling to offer. They always had a little scene of the Madonna and Joseph and the baby Jesus. And since I was a little girl with long hair, dark at that, and Mary they thought probably had dark hair, so I was often chosen to be Mary, which was a thrill, you know, for a little girl. But we would always have some sort of little Christmas play or program, sing Christmas carols, and they'd give out these little paper bags with an orange and apple, some raisins and nuts. a little candy. And we had one year, we had the same man with Santa Claus lots of times, but one year he really was, he didn't drink regularly, but he did sometimes, and that was the jolliest Christmas I ever remember in Blaine United Methodist Church. He had a wonderful costume, Santa Claus costume, but boy, he was happy. Georgetown, the town, I really saw very little of in my growing up, and as I said, because we went to school in Myrtle Beach, so I can only make a judgment there from the early 50s when I started working there. Murrells Inlet, where I did grow up, has, I think, in a certain way, Murrells Inlet has always been a rather unique community, and it's been good. That I think the creek, the salt creeks, and the ocean made all the difference in the early days, because the whole community, most everybody made part of their living out of what they could gather from whether it was clams and oysters, crabs, or fish. The community, black and white, a lot of their earning was what they could gather in the way of seafood and sell and eat. Mama used to say nobody had to go hungry in Murrells Inlet if they were able-bodied, because collards will grow year-round, and you could always, with the Walkmore River on one side and the salt creeks on the other, there was food. But I think that had a strong influence on the way that people have lived here in this community, because when people work together, they know each other in a different way. And then following that period, in the 40s, the restaurants began to build, and that caused the same situation. The kitchens were always full of local people, black and white. So I think in reference to that and other things about a small community, this has been a good community to grow up in. I remember when, it was just, there were only a couple of places that Mama called off limits for me. I mean, you could walk from one end of the inlet to the other to see a friend after school, and there was no fear about a child doing that. There's so much that we've lost, and that parents these days can't have that secure and safe feeling about their children. And I think that even here, I wouldn't feel that now if I were raising a child, even in this small community. But everyone knew everybody else, and if your own mother wasn't there to look after you, somebody else would, so I think it was a wonderful place to grow up. Plus the fact that we had so many things to do in the summertime.
What kinds of things did you do?
Stayed in the creek. All of low tide, gathering something or other. And then there was no, people had a block of ice. If they were lucky enough to have an ice box, they had a block of ice, no refrigerator. And so you gave away, what you couldn't use that evening, you gave away. And we really literally would stay out in the creek we had a little rowboat Mama got on my 12th birthday, and I don't remember doing anything all summer long but gathering seafood one way or the other, and then at high tide, swimming all of high tide. We looked like a bunch of little Indians by the end of the summer, but I remember Mama would sometimes pull my brother's little pants down when a friend came to see us because their little behinds were still white. That, I'm sure you're doing this just for people off in the future when some of these old ones are dead and gone. And I worry about, I mentioned a while ago that we can't do too much for environmental causes. There's no way to do too much. I think last week the Georgetown Times said that Mr. Evers, our county administrator, said there would be more change in Georgetown County in the next 5 years than we have seen yet, and that made me shudder. I don't know what he was talking about. I want to find out what he's talking about. But I look back on the past. When I was growing up, there was not a building on all of that strip of beach out yonder, and there never should have been a building on it because it was a flat It had high sand dunes before they built on top of the dunes, but I mean, it was just a narrow, very narrow peninsula. My grandfather came down here in 1906 or 10, 6 or I think, and he bought land from the river to the ocean, which included about a mile of that beach out there. Now, if only, Grandpapa told me he paid an extra $300 for the strip of beach because his original deed read bordered on the east by the Atlantic Ocean, but he wanted to be sure it included that strip of beach, so he got an extra deed for another $300. You know, if only some leaders in our area here had seen the possibility of keeping that as a public beach. I mean, Grandpapa paid $300. He would have said nothing but a fool would ever put a house on it. He died in 42 or 44, I think. Anyway, I mean, when he died, it was just a beautiful, beautiful stretch of sand dunes and ocean. I mean, it was Murrells Inlet's waterfront. There was never any deal made about who owned it, you know. It was just there for us to, it was Murrells Inlet's front by the ocean. But I look at Georgetown County, not just Georgetown County, it's true all over the world, all over the United States. But I think often I'll look at something like that and think, if only someone had had the vision to ask Grandpapa, would you sell it to the county? Would you give it to the county or the state? And he would have, had he been approached, I'm pretty sure, in other words, I know he told me no fool would ever put a house out there. So therefore, he would have considered that it should be kept wild. He told me he thought it was worth paying $300 for to hunt foxes on. And so now I look at the county and look at what's gone. And I'm just hoping and praying for people who are caring more about the future of our area and the people who are coming along to live here than they care about politics and power. I haven't seen it quite yet, but I'd like to think that Georgetown County will have leaders who are more visionary than in the past. We just so often things are gone and then bang. One day, a restaurant was going to build here, a new restaurant. It did build, but I happened to drive down the road and they had cut 5 live oaks. They weren't little trees, they were big live oaks. And so that prompted me to head down to Georgetown and raise the roof until we got a tree ordinance. And but we had the tree ordinance was passed before Hurricane Hugo, but I don't think anybody pays much attention to it anymore. And it was a good ordinance. We worked on it for a long time. And so I'm getting pessimistic in my old age. Don't want to, I'd rather not be. But I do hope the things that have meant so much to me in the years that I've lived here in the inlet, and the years that I've also had contacts with Georgetown, which is a lovely town, I hope that the things that have meant so much to me can still be here for people to enjoy in the future. Well, my mother wasn't so famous when I was growing up. I mean, she was to me, I thought she but she became, well, you know, the truth is, as I said, I was a child when she had some short stories published, and that was unusual in this little community, but I guess we didn't think, you know, as a child of it. My mother-in-law, it's crazy, but it's South Carolina, and she is actually a very distant cousin to my grandfather, which does happen. And, so I always knew of her. She had a summer house here, in fact, that she and her husband had bought from my grandfather. So I grew up knowing her, but never dreaming she'd ever be my mother-in-law. And I thought of her as famous when I was a child because I was born in 28 and she received a Pulitzer Prize that year for a book she'd written. So, you know, so I grew up thinking of her as a person who was well known. But I admired her greatly, but my mother was a greater lady in so many ways. Though they both were remarkable women for their time. They both were ahead of their time in many ways. Mama marched with the suffragettes when she was an art student in New York. She was always a little ahead of, but And you can't grow up with a woman like that, you know, without having it all kind of rub off a little bit. And you know, I have done so much thinking about, I've had reason to do a lot of thinking about my early childhood. You see, you know, when you meet someone, and I keep talking about race because it's been a strong thing in my life, all my life. But I think that one time, when my husband and I were living on the farm, we had a friend from Buffalo whose wife had died, and he married again. And they were going to Florida, so they were going to stop and spend the night with us. And when they came in, Ruth, his wife, we were in my living room, and the farm was surrounded by so many fields out in the distance. They were cotton fields mostly, sometimes soybeans too. But anyway, I don't remember what time of year that was and how the fields looked. But across those fields, there were numbers of homes where the people who worked for Bill still lived, and who worked on the farm, and their family before them had worked there. They weren't tenant farmers, they were living on the place, but they were paid for their work. It was that kind of a thing. Anyway, but they all had, their families had been in that location since freedom. And I remember that Ruth looked out and said, "Who lives out yonder?" And pointed to, and I said, "Jesse Weeks, he's the foreman here on the farm with Bill." And she said, "You mean he's a Negro?" I said, "Well, yes." And she said, "Who lives in that other house?" And I named Flood, who lives there. And Ruth's reaction was, "I couldn't live here, I'd be scared." But she had never personally known a black person in her life. I mean, we started talking, and I couldn't conceive of being in an environment, you know, like that. And so I consider that the fact that my life was very different has been one of the greatest blessings in my life. Because I'm certain, had I grown up like she did, and I was saying to somebody the other day, if you grow up in a city like Chicago, you're going to be with your ethnic group, whatever it is, and then this isolation and separation causes fear and causes prejudice. I talk apparently better than I write. Billy Baldwin taped me for week after week after week for months to make this book called Heaven is a Beautiful Place. Billy would come and put the tape recorder on the tape. Well, he was funny. He thought he knew Murrells Inlet was supposed to have a lot of ghosts, so he really had in mind. We'd known each other a long time, but Billy, after he'd done his book, Miss Whaley's Charleston Garden, and Miss Whaley was older than I. But I love the book. It was, you see, it was a nice book. Nothing bad happened much. I mean, I don't think anything bad happened. and it seems she had a charmed life. But anyway, Billy called me one day because I had helped him with a little book called Day Trips from Charleston many years ago, and I'd known him since then, but saw him once in a while. But he called and asked me if we could have lunch together. He came up here, and I said, "What are you working on now, Billy?" And he said, "That's what I wanted to talk to you about." And he said, "I want to do a book about you." And I said, "You're crazy as hell." But he said, "Well, I was thinking about all these ghost stories that we could put together something about the ghost and some of the history of the area." And I think I said something to him like, at my age, if I don't have more to say than that, I don't even want to talk about a book. You know, because these ghost stories have been told and retold again. I mean, everybody from Nancy Ryan to Nancy Roberts has done stories, you know, books about ghosts. And though that was a strong and important part of my childhood, we told ghost stories all the time. And enjoyed scaring our friends who came from Marion or Florence. You know, they'd come down rent a house for a week, and we'd scare them to death. One time, a little house party of girls had to go home. We frightened them so, and you know, we didn't feel very guilty about it. It was just sort of what you did, scare the wits out of them. But anyway, I didn't want to go into that as old as I am now. But anyway, so we started talking. I mean, he explained to me that he would like to do what he'd done with Miss Whaley, which was to turn on the tape recorder and let her talk. And Billy was funny one time. He said, after we'd done that for a while, he said, you know, Emily Whaley could jump from 1921 to 1970 to 1935 to 1980 in one paragraph. And he said, you seem to have started when you were 3 years old and you just keep going. But somehow or other, he said he had more editing to do because, but I don't know why. I've got kind of chronological about it. And then there are a lot of things I've thought of that I wish that I had thought of when we were doing that. I mean, different things that happened in my life that I think if I was going to tell it all, I shouldn't have told, but you can't think of everything. But I enjoyed working with Billy. I like him a lot, like his wife too. She's a wonderful person. It was fun. And I am right now supposed to be doing the final editing on a young man from Chattanooga, and I've been working for about 10 years, and probably 5 years ago we took a friend of his in to work with us with some of the editing, so that we're 3 of us now. But what we've done is collect all the work that my mother turned into the Library of Congress in the 30s. Some of it's on the internet, but very little compared to what she recorded. And then, as I mentioned earlier, this woman by Wooten who took photographs of some of the people, we have access to those photographs now. For years we couldn't find what had happened to them, but we did. So the University of South Carolina has accepted that for publication. And they accepted it a year ago in August, but we just haven't gotten our final work done. And I think Kincaid was here Thanksgiving, and we agreed we'd get it into the university before Christmas with my deadlines. But anyway, it'll be called, we think, Some of These Days, with a long, which we haven't worked out, subtitle or whatever. I mean, in other words, in reference to the Writers Project folklore stuff. I don't know, we haven't gone, but the Some of These Days, of course, is a quote from someone, and I'm sure the Some of These Days was referring to emancipation and freedom. The problem at this point is that we have more material than can go in one book. And I've been wishing for, Mama, I don't know how Mama did this, because with no tape recorder, but with a pencil, she recorded the words of so many spirituals in the churches. And sometimes there are probably maybe 4 or 5 versions of one, depending on which church she was in. I look forward to having that published, because I know that what Mama did is of value for the history of this area. It's called Freewoods because at the time of emancipation, a number of the families that had been on these rice plantations from the time that they came to America or were born there, the next generation, at the time of freedom, they really, literally, had nothing. They were suddenly free, but they had nothing. And they would, a group of the people from the rice plantations along the Waccamaw Neck, more than several families, who I'm sure had been well acquainted before freedom, and they stuck together and moved to this area that was just over in Horry County from Murrells Inlet in Georgetown County. But it was land that had not been used for rice planting because, for one, there were 2 reasons. The river bluff was too high, couldn't have been flooded. But the other reason was that it was further up the river where the tide wouldn't rise anyway. So it was just beyond the rice planting area of Georgetown County and Waccamaw Neck. And so the land was never considered of any great value in those days. And so these families went there and settled, and Toby Smalls was he was a slave driver at Richmond Hill, and many were the offspring from his family, and he's buried at Richmond Hill. And there were Smalls, Holmes, numbers of different families, but they went there and managed to build homes, farm, garden, and exist. And I've been told by several of the people in this generation that World War I was a big boost in that for the first time in their lives, some of the men in the families went into the Army and had a check coming in every month. And they had become so accustomed to making it on what they had that instead of spending that money, they used it to buy land. And so that's where they had the land originally, whether some of the masters, former masters, gave them some land. I don't think in this area, I'm not certain, but you know, we hear about the 40 acres and a mule, but that didn't turn out to be very widespread. It was a program that didn't happen, basically. And I don't know of that happening in this area, but how they actually began, nobody's quite sure anymore. But obviously they managed to get hold of some land. Perhaps some were given some. Perhaps they bought it from the former master. I don't know. But they called it Freewoods because freedom. They went there because freedom had come. And there is a big, a wonderful family. Part of that small family have given 40 acres to establish a farm museum, Freewoods Farm Museum, and I'm on the board of that, which is one of the. I'm going to have to. The doctors told me I've got to quit doing most things I've been doing, but that I told Dr. O'Neill Smalls, who's head of the program, the other day. I said I'm going to quit some things, but I'm not going to quit this one because that's my most important project these days. It's coming along. It's coming along, but it's going to be a museum to show how these people became independent farmers in the period of Reconstruction and following the Civil War and freedom, and some of those, you know, Mama's interviews were with some of those people who remembered being slaves, and some of the very ones who settled there. So I think that I've had this childhood tie to the area because. Actually, after my father died in '36, I was not well, and the doctor said I couldn't go back to school that year, so I went with Mama around collecting folklore. So that's what's had a strong influence on my life. I was able to know these people when I was a child, and then I can go now and know their grandchildren because they know who I am, because they knew Mama. And I mean, it's just been a good thing. But anyway, that we've moved 2 tobacco barns into the area. We've got a barn with 2 mules, and the farming will all be done the way it was done in those days, completely by hand. I spent about half a day out there picking peanuts off the vines the other day, and you wouldn't believe this. There were 2 old women. This made me young. There were 2 elderly women there past 90. One was 97, the other 94. They sat there from 10 till 2. We stopped for some lunch, picking the peanuts off the vines. The peanuts, you know, had been pulled up and gathered and put in the barn to dry, so they were the dried peanuts. And it was about 3 o'clock, and one of these old ladies said, you know, I'm going to have to head home pretty soon because I've got to go to work at 5. I said, go to work? 97. She takes care of an old woman who's about my age, you know. She stays with a woman at night and her grandchild so the daughter can work. And can you imagine that? And she sat there from 10, well, it was 2 o'clock then, we didn't leave till about 3, and then she was going to go to work at 5. Now, of course, that's a job where she probably goes in and spends the night, but still, can you imagine? But that was I was so sorry I hadn't taken the tape recorder out there that day. I played the devil because we had some wonderful, you know, conversation of memories of old days from those 2 women that you don't run into many past 90. But anyway, we're working. The hardest thing these days is, you know, trying to find grants and funds to do what we plan to do. But there's going to be a little area called Main Street to try to replicate a little town like a county seat back in those days with at least a church and a courthouse and a couple of things and a restaurant. And then hopefully the restaurant will be one that centers down on the way we used to cook and the way we still cook around, the kind of foods that we'd have here, rather than the Hardys. But it'll be a very educational thing for tourists and for local people, school children, once it gets going. And the good thing is that the young man who got this dream and vision about doing it, and his family, his sisters and his brother joined him in giving the 40 acres, which we could have, the only way it could have ever happened is because they gave that land, which they could have sold to condominiums, a golf course, or anything. But he teaches law at the University of South Carolina, and he is still teaching there. But he devotes every minute that he's not teaching to this, and he's just not going to drop that dream. It's going to happen one of these days, but we just haven't yet hit on the right kind of source for money.
What's his name?
O'Neill, O''Neal, Smalls. I bet he's a very attractive, but very articulate man. You wouldn't believe he grew up in Freewoods, because if you know Freewoods, it was a rare thing that he could have gotten the education he got. But his sisters too, they are teachers, and they've been a family they've all strived to have it better than their ancestors did, and they've managed to do that. They're a wonderful group of people. But I'd say that about everybody out there. There are other people that have been there always, and there are others where some have gone, say, to Detroit and worked, or other places, and have come back. And one of the wonderful things, I will say this about having the fact that Billy Baldwin talked me into doing this book, Lily Knox, whom I talked about a lot in the book, because Lily worked for my grandmother, and then when Daddy died, she came and she took care of us, or Mama couldn't have worked. And if Mama couldn't have worked, I don't know what Mama would have done with the 5 of us. But anyway, Lil stayed with us until we were big enough to make it on our own. And then Mama found her a better paying job in Marion, and she went there for the last years that she worked. But her family now, her oldest boy was in World War II. Then he settled in New Jersey after the war. And I never had known what had happened to Paul and his family. The ones who stayed here I did know and kept up with. And since that book was published, I've met about 15 of his offspring who came. They came down to see cousins, and I had given a copy of the book to their uncle Richard Knox, the third he is. And so it's just been perfectly wonderful, because they say things like, "You've given us a family we didn't know anything about," because I knew a lot about Lil's family. And so now all of his family have moved back down here. He's not living, but his widow is, and his son Paul. And so I think if I hadn't done anything else, just the fact that I did tell things I remembered about some of that community has been real good. And giving me some new friends, some Yankees. But when I went to Coker College, I was a sophomore. And I think I mentioned I went there because I could come home to Myrtle Beach on a bus. And one night the bus had left Conway, and it was not really night, it was like twilight. And in those days, the road to Myrtle Beach, there was no 501. You came down through Socastee. But Socastee was nothing but a Methodist church and a schoolhouse and a few homes back in the woods, but it was no community whatsoever. And somewhere near Socastee, somewhere just totally in the country, the bus stopped to pick up a young black woman, and she had a little child, and he was probably less than 2. She was holding him when she came into the bus. And I had, the way things worked in those days was if you got on the bus, if you were black, you went to the back and sat from the back forward, and the whites would seat, I guess, from the front backwards, and somewhere you met. There was no line on the bus that said, this is for blacks and this is for whites. But it was just according to how many people there were that was one race or the other that particular day. So what happens when I was already on the bus in Conway. I was sitting on a seat that was the last seat, and there were black people behind me. Across from me were two white people. Anyway, the seat by me was the only empty seat left in the bus. I was pretty sure because the thing had filled up to the back. This girl, the bus driver had, gotten her money, and she was walking down the aisle holding this little fella. And as the bus kind of lurched to take off, she was having to grab the seat to steady herself. And I looked up and said, you can sit down here by me. She said, no. I said, it's all right, I don't mind. And she looked like she knew she better not do that. And I was so wrong to do what I did. But anyway, I said, it's all right. And she sat down. And the bus driver in the mirror saw her sit down, and he hit the brakes. And he yelled at her to get up. And I said, it's all right. I told her she can sit by me. He said, then I'll put you both off out here in the country. And he frightened us both. But I mean, I know that she was far more frightened than I was, even though on the other hand, she wasn't far from home because she'd only been on the bus. But I mean, I really thought he was going to do that. He didn't, but he made her get up and hold that child till we got to Myrtle Beach with the empty seat sitting by me. And, it's things like when you're young and things like, you don't forget that, and it was wrong, and it should change. And I think that there's so many people, in the younger generations now that wouldn't believe that that's the way it was.